welcome you to the Wilson Center today for this dialogue on getting to equal. For those of you who've been to the Wilson Center before, you know that our dialogues are living and that they will go on after this discussion and after this reception. So I welcome you all to participate and engage with us because we do expect it to be a dialogue, hence the setup of this. I'm Gwen Young, and I'm the Director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative here at the Wilson Center. The GWLI aims to empower women across the globe, empower societies, and empower institutions to ensure that there is equality in social, economic, and political leadership across the globe. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, from the World Bank, USAID, and McKinsey, partners in what I'm calling Getting to Equal, to talk about the regulations, institutions, and practices that differentiate between men and women. Our aim is to not only provide the data on the regulations and the laws that differentiate, but to talk about why we want reforms, how we get to reforms, and how we can ensure implementation of laws and policies are in line with our aims of getting to equal. With that, I would like to turn it over to Sarah Iqbal, who is the manager of the World Bank Group's Women, Business, and the Law project, to start off our discussion. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Gwen, and thank you to the Wilson Center and all of you for being in the audience today. It's such a pleasure for me to talk about the main findings of the Women, Business, and the Law Getting to Equal report, and especially at this point in time in the gender equality agenda. We're at the end of the 20-year anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. We're at the beginning of the new cycle of the SDG framework, and we're starting to look at gender equality in a different way. I think a lot of the last 20 years have been trying to get to equal on first-generation gender issues like maternal health and education, especially primary education for girls. And a lot of these targets have been met. We have a new set of targets, and we're starting to think of gender equality in a different way. And the small piece of that we look at in the Women, Business, and the Law project is really measuring legal gender equality, looking at a micro level on why it matters, and where there might be restrictions that prevent women from achieving their economic potential. And the way that we look at these things is really, I think, from the economic perspective. We launched a couple of months ago the 4th edition of the Women, Business, and the Law report. And we found a few interesting things. One, we increased the size of our data set by 20%. We added 30 new economies, and I for sure thought that we would change the main finding of our last report. And the main finding of our last report was really in 90% of economies we saw at least one legal difference that impedes women's economic empowerment. Increasing the size of the data set by a fifth, that's actually quite big, and we found the exact same finding. Really, there's at least one law in 90% of economies across the developed world, across the developing world, that impedes women's economic opportunities. And I just want to give you a very brief flavor of that. In 100 economies, there are job restrictions on the types of jobs women can do. And that's, working in certain sectors, working at night, working in certain industries. I was talking to a group of women from Sri Lanka recently, and they were saying in the retail sector, women can't work at night. Well, what does that mean? In grocery stores, in shops, there's a blanket restriction on women's night work. I was talking to colleagues in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and they were telling me in the Kyrgyz Republic, they're working to reform these types of restrictions. And mining, construction, transportation, there are a lot of jobs in the Kyrgyz Republic women can't do. The average salary for a woman or anyone working in the education sector in the Kyrgyz Republic is 74 euros a month. The average salary in the mining sector is 193 euros a month. Now, most women work in the education sector. Almost no women work in the mining sector. How do you change that? What does that mean for women's the income gap for women? The reason that we measure these things is really to look at economic outcomes for women. And essentially we find in these 100 economies where women face job restrictions, the gender wage gap is larger. There's a gender wage gap in every single economy in the world, but it is actually significantly larger in countries that have job restrictions on women. And that's because of sector selection and sorting. It's not that Wade makes more money as a man because he's a man, but rather I as a woman pick jobs and am sorted into jobs that actually pay less. In the Russian Federation, there are 456 specific jobs women cannot do because they are women. These are non-nursing mothers, non-pregnant women, just a woman who can't do those jobs. And it doesn't really make sense why they can't do them. There's an argument that, are these really being enforced? In fact, they are, because we've seen court cases. A woman in 2008 sued the St. Petersburg Metro Train Authority to try and get a job. This was the height of the financial crisis. Not that many industries were hiring. She tried to get this job. She couldn't get it. And she took this all the way up to the Russian Supreme Court, and she lost. And she lost because they felt it wasn't part of a woman's maternal and health function that these jobs were dangerous for women. And I guess that's another point that I want to stress. It's not that these restrictions are discriminatory because the intent is to be discriminatory. I would like to caution you on that. It's more they tend to be protective of women. They look at women in a different way than men and try and have legislation that protects them, protects their maternal function, protects their family role. And we're not saying that that's a bad thing. What we're saying is actually look at the way you're constructing your legislation. And I'll give you another good example. In France, there's a job restriction on women. They can't be in jobs that require them to sort of lift, I think it's more than 25 kilograms. And basically, that prevents them from working in things like the Postal Service, FedEx, UPS. And the question is, well, why that weight? That's actually the average weight of a 5-year-old child. I've seen women, like a large 4-year-old, maybe a skinny 5-year-old, working mothers all the time. They'll pick up their kids and move them from point A to point B. In sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East and North Africa, women carry loads much harder than that. Sort of the question is, why are these restrictions in place, and what is the economic effect it has on women's participation in the economy, women's voice and agency, sort of women's ability to do what they want to do. And another area that we started sort of measuring 2 years ago, and we've really expanded out to the full set of the database, is actually looking at legislation on violence against women. I want to touch on this briefly, mainly because we're in the middle of the 16 days of activism against violence against women. We measure things like domestic violence legislation, sexual harassment, the minimum age of marriage. And it's interesting, we found in the 173 economies that we cover, 46 economies have no legislation on domestic violence, no laws at all on domestic violence, and that actually makes a difference for women's life expectancy. Women are more likely to survive past the age of 65, where there are laws in place preventing domestic violence, punishing perpetrators, and there's a simple reason for that. A third of all murders of women actually happen within the family, either through a spouse, a domestic partner. There's a lot of intra-household violence against women, and domestic violence laws help to prevent that. And what's even more interesting is we started mapping out when this legislation was introduced. 25 years ago, there was almost no country in the world that had legislation on domestic violence. And that's not to say you couldn't prosecute, but it was under general murder law or assault, but there was nothing specific to that. And what we've seen in the past 25 years, and in particular in the past 20 years, driven by things like the Beijing Platform for Action, the CEDAW Convention, that is the convention eliminating all forms of discrimination against women, the Belém de Paro Convention in Latin America, the Maputo Protocol in Sub-Saharan Africa, countries start introducing legislation on domestic violence. And I do encourage you to pick up a copy of the executive summary of our report outside. You'll see a very interesting graph, and the graph basically shows a spike in countries introducing legislation on domestic violence after an international treaty or commitment is introduced. And the reason that I point that out is I'm not an economist, I'm not a policymaker, I'm basically an international lawyer. And essentially, focusing on the law, we often wonder, does it make a difference? We introduce these conventions, we talk in international fora, does it make a difference in the people we're trying to help? And I would argue that in terms at least of domestic violence legislation, it does. Because it does reduce violence against women, and introducing these laws does help a lot. And the fact that these laws were introduced in my lifetime, most countries in the world introduced legislation protecting women. I think that's huge. And the fact is more and more countries are introducing these types of laws. Saudi Arabia is actually one of the few countries in the Middle East and North Africa region to have a law on domestic violence. And to me, that's huge. I think it is important to look at the movement of gender equality in the context. So we expect a lot out of countries, and certainly not every country is where we would expect them to be, but they move at their own pace and at a pace that I think is acceptable within that society. And I think this data set is not meant to name and shame countries, but I think rather to encourage them, to point out where there are gaps in the law and shine a spotlight for policymakers where they can introduce legislation that's better for women and remove discrimination where it holds women back. And I'll stop at that note, I think, because I'm going over time.
Wade, I'll turn it over to you. Wade, it comes to us from USAID, but a background in economic development, rule of law, I'll call it enabling environment with a focus on gender. And he will definitely take us from the data and the economics into the implementation and social cultural aspects of it. Take it away, Wade.
Thank you. Actually, thank you, Sarah. That was great. Those of you who have not read this report, okay, pick it up on your way out. Gives you something to do on the way home, or tomorrow is fine. There's no rush. It's actually a very important data set that many of us are using for a number of things, and really nice to see the new edition out. I'd like to ask Quaylen Ellengrud next, just to tell us a little bit about what we can hope for. You know, we've got sort of a theme here, this getting to equal. We're looking at how laws have inhibited that or can change and help us to get to equal. But Quaylen has done some fascinating work on what if we moved towards equality, what would be the economic impact of that? And she and her colleagues at McKinsey have produced some numbers that even in Washington, D.C. are considered to be large. So I'll let you give the numbers and tell us a little bit about your work.
Absolutely. So McKinsey for decades had really been investing in how do women advance in the workplace. And just this past year, we started to take a step back and say, globally, how do we think about this on a much larger scale? Where are the women? Where will they be over time? And what can we expect if we do nothing or continue at current rates versus how much money is on the table if we actually get this right and really push on this front? And the number that you're referring to, there's two big numbers that you'll see in the report out there. The first one is 28 trillion. And the second one is 12 trillion. And let me talk you through those two numbers and why we think the 12 trillion is aspirational but achievable. The 28 trillion says, let's look at women around the world. And our data set similarly had 95 countries around the world that covered 90% of the women globally and over 90% of GDP. And we said, when you compare men and women in the workplace, there's three different things that we wanted to consider. The first was, are women working? So are they working at all? And most models that we've seen that try to size this opportunity certainly look at that, but they don't always take into account the second two things. The second thing was part-time, full-time mix. And in certain countries, you see more of a skew on this element than others. And the third thing was the sector mix, which we've talked about, skewing towards certain service sectors or lower-paying jobs in general. If women were to match men globally across those three factors, working, part-time work, and sector mix, that is worth globally $28 trillion, so 240 million jobs. But we said that's a huge number, and anybody can put up huge numbers, but what is really achievable and what's aspirational here? So we said, let's take a look at specifically what has happened over the last 10 years. What countries in which regions have really closed the gap so we can look to those best practices, share them, and hopefully accelerate this pace of change. So we split the 95 countries up into 11 regions. And we said, which is the biggest gainer by country across those three elements in terms of workforce participation, part-time, full-time mix, and sector mix? And we said, let's have every country in that region match the best in region sort of scenario. And that's what actually gets you to the 12 trillion. So historically, we have factually seen that rate of improvement happen over the last 10 years in that region. So in that both geography, but also socioeconomic general space. And we think the 12 trillion is achievable there. So those are the numbers and how they boil out. And I think it's helped us focus. So most people in this room, by virtue of the fact that you're here, you probably believe it's morally the right thing to do. Unfortunately, not everybody believes that. And so by putting a big number on the table, it has helped get the attention of other people who might not be similarly motivated.
Susan Markham, those of you who read these may guess that Susan and I have met before. Susan is our senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment at USAID. And I left open the first question, just sort of open for her to make comments. So I'm just going to let you make comments at this point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Wade, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting us on this important conversation. It's so intriguing from USAID points of view. We're a big agency, and we are trying to pull together different aspects of the work that we do in order to get to work towards gender equality and women's empowerment. I should say, just about 3 years ago, we passed or implemented a new gender policy, and so many of the kinds of laws that you're talking about match very closely to the objectives that we have at USAID. The first objective of the gender policy is to close gaps in access to resources. So some of these laws really work towards that, whether it is access to credit or land ownership, even basically at citizenship level, but also access to political office and these sorts of issues. Laws are a great first step to help close the gap in access to resources that are provided by the state or provided by the private sector. The second objective of the USAID gender policy is responding and trying to prevent gender-based violence. And obviously, as mentioned before, laws are a very key first step to preventing that, whether it's domestic violence or in the workplace or more broadly. And then the third, which is perhaps a bit more controversial, is increasing women's decision-making. But there are certain examples of that through quota laws or other more affirmative action laws, which can help increase decision-making for women and girls. And so what I would like to, of course, drive Wade towards is, this idea that laws are just the first step. I think oftentimes in my background is more in the democracy and human rights, where we work for years to help implement these laws or help pass the laws. And we work through advocacy, and we work through the governments, and we work through civil society to put the right law on the books. And then we're so relieved, and then we realize that was just the first step. And really getting to this next step of how do we implement them in a way that's meaningful for the citizens of that country. And so, but I do think that this work is so important, because I think before it started taking place, we were working very piecemeal and didn't have a good map of where the laws were, both the baseline and the progress that we've made. But then it does help us be more specific in our strategies for that next step on what has worked and what hasn't. So great stuff.
Let me throw it to all of you on this issue of implementation. Laws have a value. When we talk about rights in a legal system, rights only accrue when there is a law in place. Without rights, we have lots of nice ideas, but nothing enforceable. So it's good to have a law, but those of us who work in reform in any area know that having a law by itself is, as Susan was just saying, it's in many ways, the law gets passed. It's like preparing for the New York Marathon, and you get to the marathon, the gun goes off, and you celebrate. That's not really the idea, is it? The point is running the marathon, and the marathon starts when the gun goes off, when the law gets passed. Can you talk a little bit about how do we get there? We do see some places where we have seen systems in place that mean that the rights are actually going to grow and women will have greater equality. But in other places, we see laws passed for any number of reasons, to impress the international community because there's a conditionality or whatever. How do we move from legislation to implementation?
Maybe I can take the first stab at that question. And I absolutely think that is the right question, and I agree with Susan. We spend a lot of time thinking about legislation, getting the right stakeholders together, passing the right laws, and then we're relieved, we celebrate, we go home. And it's really the first step, and in many ways the easiest step, actually. Step 2, step 3, all of that is much more difficult. And I would say first things, once you pass a good piece of legislation on gender equality, you need to let the women know. I think part of it is, you pass a law, you go home, nobody knows about it. They don't know what rights they have, and they don't know how to enforce them. And one part of it is to continue the work with advocacy campaigns. There are a lot of civil society organizations at the country level who are doing a lot in terms of letting women know what their legal rights are and how they enforce them. The other is to look at how you set up that piece of legislation, and does it have ways to enforce it embedded within. And here I'm talking about the infrastructure for enforcing that. I'm talking about the organizations of government. You know, what does the court system look like? Are the judges trained? Are the prosecutors trained? If we're talking about domestic violence, is there revenue associated with that? I mean, I think the biggest part of implementation that we don't really look at is where's the budget to implement that law? You know, I think what's nice, for example, in Brazil, they passed a very comprehensive domestic violence piece of legislation called the Maria de Penha law. We talk about that quite a bit, and I know in your report, Quaylen, you mentioned the Maria de Penha law as well. It took, I think, maybe something like 20 years to pass it based on advocacy. There's a horrific case, actually, the case of Maria de Penha, and she suffered quite horrible domestic violence at the hands of her husband repeatedly, and she advocated for the passage of this law. But the question is, it's very comprehensive, but there is money tied to it. They look at it at the state level, and I think part of it is letting women know their rights, having the implementation, the mechanisms for enforcement in that legislation, and then constantly monitoring what is the outcome, what is the impact, are cases being tried? You know, are there trainings for prosecutors? Do people know, you know, what does it look like? And then going back and thinking of it, the implementation as an iterative process. Are we missing something out? So for example, you know, is there a piece missing? Is there not budget for shelters? Do we need a phone hotline? You know, is there something else that we can do? And then embedding that, maybe not within the legislation, but looking at the regulations, or, you know, is this something that civil society can pick up? Maybe even the private sector has a place to play. The IFC, in fact, is working in Papua New Guinea on domestic violence with the private sector. And the reason that they're doing that is actually violence against women is a huge problem in Papua New Guinea, and it leads to a great loss of productivity. And they're working with the legislation, but the private sector is also working to have more sort of targets to look at days lost of productivity. They're also having, for example, sort of counselors dealing with this in families through the emphasis of the corporations, the mining corporations, et cetera.
I just wanted to pick up a bit on that. I think a couple of things, as you said, once you put a law into place, you have to look at what the processes to enforce it are, what the resources are behind it, you know, and very holistically, the other piece of society. And often, in my experience, what has happened too is when you're putting it into place, despite all that hard work, you're a little bit of preaching to the choir. And you need to go back and talk to religious leaders or to the private sector or to people in the community about what it means and how to access and how to use the law and what that means. Because sometimes you spend a long time talking about amongst yourselves and those of us in this room that might believe it, but you have to go also and dispel some myths. It's sort of like the access to finance argument. It's not just giving the women the training for the access to finance, actually talking to the banks about their behaviors and what types of clients they want and how they have to structure their services and their products that people will want to use. So I think that piece about the advocacy and going out and sort of that selling the law and what it means and how people can access it within a community, I think is very important. And it doesn't just stay in that capital city, and it doesn't stay with the people that were sort of behind it from the beginning, but you get out to all the other actors in society, from the fathers to the religious leaders to the young kids to the grandmas, so that they know how this happens. And the last piece I'll just add is a lot, as we know, in the developing world, which I'm not sure if that's a politically correct statement anymore, but the private sector plays a huge role in everybody's life in the delivery of services and actually has a huge impact on whether you're even able to access the service. So having that private sector dialogue and the private sector understanding the interplay is very, very important.
Two thoughts just to illustrate what you're describing in this selling the law, and I think it is women and men becoming more aware. We looked at literally 500 case examples of when it was more effective to accelerate some of this change, whether it was legal change or enforcement. One example that I love is called bell bajao, which means ring the bell. And it's a beautiful example of what we see in the most effective interventions. It's when a government entity partners with a corporate entity, partners with an NGO of some sort. In this particular case, ring the bell means, sort of, even if you're a bystander to domestic violence. In this case, India had just passed a domestic violence law. And they wanted to build awareness because a law is only as good as the people who know about it. And so the Indian government partnered with Ogilvy Mather, sort of PR, advertising, partnered with a grassroots mobilization NGO. And they all worked together to get celebrity endorsements, to get onto these soap operas and weave it into the storylines. And they got millions and millions of impressions, not people who felt like they were being preached to, but really people who were just becoming more aware of, wow, if I'm a bystander, I have an obligation as well, and how do I think about that? How might that actually happen? And I think it's beautiful when those three different types of actors come together to have something on a very different scale than what we typically talk about.
Good. You brought up finance already. Let's jump into that for a second. As you mentioned, it's not just about getting the women's section of the financial system fixed. If the system doesn't work, or very few people are getting what they need. But if we have to prioritize when we're looking at women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion and so on. Where would you focus? What are some of the things that we can be doing now in the short term and over the long term? We know, the mortgage system takes decades to fix, and that's not going to be a quick answer for women getting credit. So we want to work on that, but in the 20 years before they get their first loan based on a mortgage, what else can we be doing?
I'm happy to jump in and share some early thoughts. I think it's exciting because in this day and age, you have things like M-Pesa in Africa, right? Mobile banking via minutes, cell phone minutes. And you have these things that can really accelerate our access through digital, through mobile phones. But one of the biggest challenges is that globally, 200 million less women than men are literate, and 200 almost million less women than men have access to financial services. And it's not a coincidence that those two numbers are so darn similar, right? If you don't have a cell phone and you can't access it and you can't sort of read through your cell phone, it's hard to improve your life through that mobile access. And so I think it's not just the products and how do we simplify and distribute the products or think better, more holistically about microfinance. I think it's around this digital literacy piece and how do we use that to accelerate some of the improvement and also in some cases build confidence. It's not just about can I access the loan, but how do I build the confidence in a woman or in a small community to use that loan to better her life and better her family's life.
And also, I think sometimes in looking at access to finance for women, we don't really understand what is some of the basic impediments. And I'll give you an example. In the Women, Business, and the Law data set, we measure where, sort of via legislation, married women need their husband's permission to open a bank account. That is a really basic legal impediment. In countries like Niger, in Congo, DRC, that's a rule on the books, and it's actually enforced. And it's not so rare to have that rule on the books. That rule basically comes from Old French law. So it used to be the case in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in Spain, and very recently. So from the 60s and the 70s, they changed that in the 1980s in Spain. I'm looking at the person sitting right in front of me, and I'm guessing you were probably born in the 1980s. If you were born in Spain, maybe this is a rule that affected your mom. It's very interesting how the legal history works, and this was something that was in place in Latin America based on the Spanish legislation. And after they changed it in Spain, we started seeing changes in Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay. You can actually plot it on a timeline. Another thing that we look at sort of through the World Bank's Findex data set, actually looking at financial inclusion, is the gender gap in access to basic bank accounts. And in regions like the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, where there's actually a gender gap in women having basic bank accounts, the number one reason they say they don't have one is because somebody else in their family does, and that's usually the husband. And so the question is, in basic empowerment, why are women not having access to finance, even basic financial inclusion, and what can we do to get around that? One, I think, is some of the things that Quaylen was talking about, but also we can look at ways that women can leverage what they already have access to. So for example, microfinance, something like 90% of microfinance users are women, but can they leverage that to get credit? You know, are the rules of the credit infrastructure system allowing them to leverage what they already have if they don't, you know, Wade was talking about mortgages, right? So if it's not land that they have, if it's not housing that they have, and I think it's fairly well documented, at least on a country level. We don't know the numbers globally, but on a country level, women have less access to land and housing than men. And in most countries by quite a bit. And so the question is, can they leverage reputation collateral? You know, their history of paying back microfinance loans or payments to utilities, payments to retailers. Is the credit system structured to capture that? One new question we added in Women, Business and the Law this year was actually, is there non-discrimination in access to credit on the basis of gender and on marital status? And that's actually important. 46 countries in the world have this. It's an emerging trend, and it's not just in Europe, it's not just in high-income countries. Actually, South Africa has this. And the US was actually a leader in this. They introduced the Equal Opportunity Access to Credit Act in the 1970s. And they, you know, when they were discussing it in Congress, it wasn't for gender. Actually, it was on the basis of race and ethnicity. And they, there was a female congresswoman, and she said, hey, you must have forgotten women. Let's add gender and let's add marital status. And it was actually quite important, the marital status, because what used to happen in the US, also in my lifetime, is basically if your husband died or you know, you got divorced, you had no credit history because it was wrapped up in his name. I mean, it's very, very recent, some of these things. And I think we assume that these are problems in certain regions of the world, in certain income categories, and we don't realize our own history and how recent some of this is.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the credit cards, Mrs. James Markham, you know, in our households. My mother's name was nowhere on those cards. But even more basic, I was at a Women World Banking conference in Berlin last month and talking about women who are working in the market who were basically had small businesses, although they might not call it that, literally had their stalls in front of banks and did not have accounts. It was an institution not created for them. It didn't welcome them, it didn't reach out to them, it spoke in a language that was foreign to them. And so these mental ideas of what we do with our money, who we trust with it, I mean, it was social norms that they themselves, they were believed society-wide. It wasn't a gendered idea, but they and the husbands or men in their lives didn't think that they should be walking into those buildings. And so it was interesting because 50% of the people in the audience were bankers. And the word empowerment didn't even come up till after lunch. You know, they were talking about customers and services and how do we get more women in the door, and not even thinking about the power of those banking institutions for them, but just taking it down to the basic level of who is this institution made for and who is welcome to walk in that door.
Sorry, there's one thing that I want to add. So when Susan was talking, it reminded me of one thing that we don't really look at. In looking at from the gender lens, we need to assess policies in terms of how they affect women. And what I'm talking about here is really anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism laws. So under AML, CFT regimes, there are certain things that banks have to comply with to make sure that the money is coming from a place that basically is not dealing with money laundering or terrorism financing. And so they look at ID cards, you know, make sure that address requirements are there. And the reason that I bring this up is we actually measure where women need permission to get national ID cards. You know, there's 10 to 12 countries in the world where they need their husband's permission or perhaps the permission of a guardian to get a national ID card. And so from a gender lens, I think you often have to step back 3 or 4 or sometimes even 10 spaces and look at the very beginning of a transaction. You know, what is the basic beginning? If I have, as a woman, need my husband's permission to get a national ID card, I'm not gonna have that card. I'm gonna be afraid to go into the bank. If they ask me for this documentation, maybe I won't have it. Maybe I'll need my husband's permission to have it. Maybe I don't have a birth certificate to get that national ID card. There are certain countries in the world where women do not register the birth of their children. The husbands do that. Legally, it is the husband's obligation position to do that. And, you know, maybe if it's expensive or far away or the registry is in the main business city, maybe they'll register their son, but they won't register their daughter. I mean, I think part of it is understanding none of this is rocket science, but we don't look at access to finance from a gender lens, and so we miss very, very simple things that maybe we should look at from the beginning.
Let me just summarize that a little bit. Ask about finance. We immediately got into education, registration, banks' own perception of their customers, as well as a host of laws. We need bank account, we need saving, we need credit information, we need different forms of collateral, we didn't even get into this. How do you get into the court system and enforce all of these things if somebody isn't providing them for you, and so on. Highly complex, and let's just say getting these done and fixed is expensive, right? If you're putting together projects, and I know many in this audience are in the project world. We are in the development organizations or other groups, and we put together projects. I think it's easy to say that getting a law passed is a lot cheaper than seeing it implemented. So within a resource-constrained environment, let me just throw out the idea, and I'll throw it to you, Susan, from a USAID perspective. What are some of the things that we can do to push? We don't always have the money to do a soup to nuts approach. Actually, we may have neither money for soup nor nuts. We got a bus ticket to the shop or something. How do we approach this? How do we get to equal? Silver bullet would be fine here.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Golden nugget, silver bullet, whatever you're looking for there. I mean, across the work that we do, we try to add gender integration and take gender issues into account across the whole field. So for instance, it might not be a standalone, we're going to increase women's access to credit, but look broadly at the credit or financial system and make sure gender is a part of that. Right from the very beginning, I mean, you just start with some of the stats that they provide. What laws are there? Who is actually taking advantage of these laws? Who has bank accounts, who don't? Just basic information that, by the way, when I say it's basic information, I always thought that was a first easy step as well, which is not in many countries where we were getting that data. But starting from where people are, but if you're asking the questions from the beginning and understanding the gender aspects of many of these issues, you build gender into everything. You know, I think education, global health, they were like, yes, of course we do gender. And then you get into finance or infrastructure or energy, and they're like, you know, kilowatts are gender neutral. And I was like, oh, they're not, you know, but we can talk about that, you know, but just this whole idea of that there isn't, you know, who gets energy, when they, what kind of energy they get, and where they are in the big national plan. You know, I mean, those are very specific issues. Who's in charge of the lights in the house before you get the power grid? So all of these issues, so that's what we're working to do, not just because we're in a resource-constrained environment, but because it's a smart thing to do. If we're going to have a program that deals with a range of issues, and you're not taking the roles that women and men play in their daily lives into account as you build that program, it's not going to be as effective, so you might not reach as many people or make the change that you want to make, but it's also not sustainable. Creating a program for not even half, even if you said all men, you know, 50% of the population, there are such variations within men that you'd be thinking, I'm looking at the major ethnic group who lives in the capital city, who can read and take part in this program, right? So if you don't take these different issues into account, I mean, it's just not the smart thing to do or sustainable over the long run.
I just want to make a comment on that, and to build on a previous comment that was made, and sort of taking into account from the beginning is also who you're including in the discussion as you're developing and you're designing these things. Because that's very important, that inclusive sort of whose voice is at the table, whose needs are you meeting, and what are you trying to do. And so if you don't have kind of the right people at the table, and that sounds very judgmental to say the right people, if you're not inclusive around the table, from the entire population or the needs you're trying to meet, to the most marginalized, to the women, to the disabled, to people who aren't in the city and who aren't literate, you often don't know what you're trying to develop and who you're trying to reach. And until you have that voice at the table, you can miss the mark.
Well,
I would just say, I think we can be much more creative about bringing in corporate dollars as well. I think the funding gap compared to the marketing budgets of many of these organizations is actually not that big. And so you have a couple, I would say, of forward-thinking companies. So Walmart is targeting $20 billion sourced from women-owned businesses. You've got Unilever with 70,000 women entrepreneurs distributing all over India. You've got Vodafone, who launched a literacy app in Egypt, right, on their phones, and in Europe has a violence against women sort of safety button that you can press that alerts the authorities to exactly where you are. I mean, these are creative elements from companies that are trying to do the right thing and getting some exposure and marketing sort of benefit from it. But I think if we were to partner more systematically with them and target them for the core competencies that they have, right, Vodafone for apps or whatever it is, Ogilvy Mather in that Bell Bajao example, I think this could go a lot further.
good.
And just to add, I mean, I think across development organizations, we live in a resource-constrained environment, but I fully agree with what Susan was saying. Part of it is just understanding from the project design phase, how do you incorporate gender? Because I can't tell you how many times it's happened that someone will come at the end of the project and say, you know, I need to incorporate gender, what can you give me? And it's like, well, at that point, really not much. You should think about it intelligently from the beginning, and if you do it that way and you look at the diagnostics that exist and try and incorporate them from a gender lens, it may actually not cost you as much money as you think. So for example, you were talking about access to finance projects. We spring from a part of the World Bank group that actually looked at finance and private sector development. And I think, you know, when we started this work in 2008, we really did not understand how gender could be incorporated. Well, now if we work on financial inclusion and say my colleague comes to me and says, I'm working on a financial inclusion strategy, I don't know, in Indonesia, and these are some of the things that we're interested in. I say, well, look, have you looked at Nigeria? They have tiered know your customer requirements to allow women to have more inclusive access to bank accounts. Is this something perhaps that you could incorporate in Indonesia based on your stakeholders? There are a lot of examples that are out there and smarter ways to incorporate gender in projects that don't cost as much money or take as many resources as you would think. But the problem is there are not that many people who know how to carry it forward in a lot of development organizations. We're seeing more and more of this now. I think people thinking of incorporating gender in, I think, more robust, intelligent ways. But it is difficult, and I think we need sustained action and push from the top that actually forces us to do it. Because to lead a project is very difficult. There's 100 things that you're trying to incorporate, and many mandates that come from the top. This is just another one. And how do you do it?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the question. And you know what? We've got Gwen here to answer that question. How do you do it? You're here at the Wilson Center, which has a fundamental purpose in influencing the top. How do we influence the top to maintain the sustained effort? And this time, not the top of the agency, but the top of a nation.
That is a good question, and that's my role. No, I think the first thing is a bit of what we're doing today, which is, and Sarah and I talked about this earlier, sort of having the data, so having the evidence base and really knowing what we're talking about. And so I say, you know, I often say when I'm giving my elevator speech to people about the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, I'm there to kind of bring the data to people and bring it out there into the world and showcase it and highlight so we actually know what we're talking about then. So I think part of it is having the data. And then it's having the conversations and putting everybody around the table across the globe around the data and having access to it. I was with a Libyan woman yesterday who graduated from one of our training institutes that we do under the Global Women's Leadership. And she said, I didn't even really know the rights that we had. But once I knew the rights that we had, then I realized what we could do. And, you know, another woman in Senegal saying, we didn't even know we had the right to vote. You know, and so access and information, I think, is everything. I think the second thing is what we are trying to do, which is put women into leadership positions. And it goes a bit about being inclusive, but, you know, data has shown that having women around the table, which, let's be clear, we are half the population, if not more, right, brings in all voices, brings in all creative solutions. Other data shows from the economics, as we've been talking about, that your GDP will grow by 6.8% more if you have women around the table. But it shows specifically in politics that You will have more progressive policies, that there will be policies around education, health. You will talk more about the access to services, so not just the law, but how are you implementing the law. And I think somebody gave the example earlier of the women around the table saying, wait a minute, let's think about us. So part of it is trying to put those women in those leadership positions and make sure the leadership looks like what's going on in the world. And, you know, the Wilson Center is often thought of as the mindset or the thought leader. So I was very deliberate, and I'm saying we're empowering women, but we're empowering societies and empowering institutions, which also goes to holding them accountable for these services, for delivering, and for saying it's not just enough to sign the paper, count the box, I trained 18 women, I have 18 women in my organization, and move on. You know, what are you doing and what are you showing and how you do that? How are you moving on some of these indicators, and what does that look like on the other side?
We have promised a dialogue, and we haven't gotten there yet, have we? Meaning that's the other side of the dialogue. But before I get there, I want to just sort of give a quick question. Let's say the building decides to hold a fire alarm 5 minutes from now just to test the system, and everybody rushes out. What are the two big things you would want people in this room to know? What are the big priorities? We look at all the indicators, all the areas that we're addressing in here, and there are many because it is complex. But, you know, two things, if you could ask everybody, let's focus on this for a while, what would they be? And I'll just start with you, Susan. And two, I know, is not nearly enough, but...
Well, I think something that we've touched on a bit, but we haven't focused on very much today is also the need to change social norms and cultural attitudes. And that if you're thinking that, look, we're going to work with individual women and we're going to build their capacity and their skills and their desire to play a different role in their society, that's great. Then we need to change the institutions, political, financial, the social institutions like marriage and citizenship, so that women can walk into those institutions and feel that they have a role there. But this overarching social norms and attitudes is tough. I mean, especially as a person who needs to measure and account for the money that we spend, it takes a long time, it's very complicated, and it's sometimes hard to measure without large-scale polling and social attitudes, but without it, nothing else is going to matter. I would like to say, though, I do think laws can help do that. Whether it's CEDAW, the Convention to End the Discrimination Against Women, or laws that are passed in countries, it shows a willingness. It shows something to hold the government accountable to. This law was passed, so let's try to meet it, or let's try so that laws can also help with that. You need the change in attitude to get the laws, but the laws can also help change more widespread attitude. So I would send those as my two quick things.
Sarah?
So Wade, I think I only have one key takeaway, and I think my key takeaway is this: it's important to get the men involved. It's really, I think, about what Susan was talking about, changing social norms and attitudes. How do you do that by preaching to the choir? Well, the answer is you don't. You know, I do a lot of speaking on this topic, and generally there are never any men in the audience, so I applaud the 3 men I see in this audience. and Wade, I mean, I think it is really important to look at this holistically, because it's not an issue just about women, but it's actually about families, societies, communities, and about economic empowerment. I mean, I think it's important to have a rights-based approach, but it's also incredibly important to have an economic empowerment and economic growth approach, because a lot of the countries that were going to reform their laws have already done so. They've done so because of CEDAW, because of their international commitments, or because you know, they were pushed from society. It's the countries that haven't really reformed. Like, how do you get that reform happening? And I think, how do you change mindsets who maybe don't believe it's a moral imperative? Well, I think it is an economic imperative, and I actually think it's really amazing that the IMF is talking about these issues, that Christine Lagarde is talking about these issues, that they're publishing papers about the economic cost of gender equality, that McKinsey is talking about the economic cost of gender inequality, and sort of that more and more international organizations are framing the issue in a different way. I think a lot of the first generation issues about gender equality, I mean, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but at least when I started at the World Bank, all we talked about was gender issues in maternal health or education, but we never really talked about, in private sector development, in financial development, in economic empowerment. And I really do think we need to take the conversation forward and get men involved as a full-on societal issue.
I couldn't agree more. The two things I would leave you with, the first is that you can't have economic equality without social equality. We took a look at 100 different factors. We narrowed it down to 15 that matter, and we split them apart into economic equality and social equality. And what you see as you look across the 95 countries that we were looking at is there are very few exceptions, really no exceptions where you can have one without the other. And so if you want to capture the 12 trillion, you really have to work on these social equality elements. There are some elements that you can grow your way out of in terms of GDP per capita improvements like maternal mortality and some of these other things, but most of the equality factors in terms of social equality that we're looking at, you don't grow your way out of, right? Even if you look at the most advanced nations, you still have political representation that is not completely unequal. You still have violence against women. That's a global average of 1 in 3 women experiencing violence from an intimate partner. So these are global issues that don't go away through growth. So that'd be number one. You can't have economic equality without the social equality. And the second thing I would leave you with is let's get creative. I think in this day and age, we can really accelerate the progress by using new approaches, social media, digital, pulling in corporations to be more creative about how we resource and accelerate the change. And I think we'll all be quite excited by how many more people we can reach in a faster time than we've even seen historically.
As the last one, and now that everyone took my ideas, no. It's always the danger of being last. No, but the social equality piece is really important in people's voices, but I will leave you with this. I think the partnership piece is really critical as we're showing today. And I think it's that partnership where we get together and we talk about what everyone's doing and we realize that it's not one person that can do it alone. It's not just the private sector that's going to change the world. It's not just the NGO that's going to change the world. It's not just the president that's going to change the world. We all have to work together, and I think we're seeing that through how we define leadership, transformative leadership, how we define workspaces and open workspaces. Well, let's be creative, and let's do it together, because I think that's what's really important, and that's sharing the information, finding the creative solutions, and looking at the whole problem, or I will call it the movement as opposed to the problem, in a real holistic way.
Okay, I know the first question is going to be, well, how do we get more men involved? So I'll just go ahead and answer that one, okay? I get that one frequently. Let me just say this about getting men involved. It's not that hard. You invite us, and you do it really specifically, right? It's not a hint. Hinting to a man is like leaving a note for the dog. It doesn't matter how clear you think it was, it's not going to work. Just, and sorry, man, but we do have to admit this, right? We know how to take a hint as a survey question and not get up and do something. So get somebody to read over your gender analysis of something. Have them look. I will tell you, I had this discussion recently. Seeing numbers sometimes changes your whole world. When you start saying, well, I know violence is a problem. No, 35% of women living today have suffered violence. Okay, that's a big number. That's a life-changing number. We can get that information out and get it to men who care, but they don't quite get it yet. And many of us don't. Of course, many of us do. But all right, with that, questions from the audience? Yes, Natalie.
You're going to have to talk into the mic because it's being recorded. So
I think a mic is coming your way. Although a mic got to someone else first.
there's one woman right here. Yep.
All right.
Hello. Yes, Natalie Paneto, Survivors of the War. First of all, I want to thank you for the great presentation and great topic, because this is very important. This is something outstanding. You're doing a really great job of empowering women. So my question is, we are creating now a project for Ukraine, specific for the women farmers, because they are the minority and suddenly they are doing the job, but don't take it personal, but the men coming and taking over. Like, they're the one who doing the hard job, but the man is the one who taking the fruits of this job. So the project is about to more empower women and to teach them and to open them door and motivate them and give them the information which they can use. But the question is it's in an ocean of sharks, and the women who are starting, they're like small fishes. What is the best way to motivate them to start and don't be afraid and don't give up and try and do it? Thank you.
Susan?
One of the strategies we often use is connecting women to each other. That this whole networking idea where they're sharing the ideas, they're sharing what's going wrong, but through the process of sharing with each other, they're also empowering one another by sharing their success stories. So whether it's in women who are many farmers, most farmers around the world are women, whether it is women in politics or in business, connecting women together, I mean, any similar group together, but specifically we've seen with women who are often feeling separated, feeling alone, feeling like they're the only one going through it, when they can connect and share the technical aspects of it, share what has worked and what hasn't worked for them, and then support each other, either formally or informally, that has really been one of the most effective strategies that we've used. You can do it through women who are of equal and similar to one another. It's also powerful if you connect women from within one sector to women in a different sector. So for instance, maybe small farmers and another group of society that benefits from those farmers. So because you get something different from that sort of network. And what we've also found is connecting people who have different financial interests. So for instance, if the farming goes bad because of a natural disaster, if they are connected to women in a different sector, that they can buoy each other and share those. So networking in different ways, but certainly the power of many as opposed to individuals is very powerful.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go to the back. Yes, you're next. I see that hand. Yes, that's you. Yeah. Okay, good.
Me? Thank you very much. I think this is a very important conversation. I'm Lina Abu Habib from the Women Learning Partnership, and I'm based in Lebanon. I just want to engage in this conversation with you and pick up on a number of important points that you have said. Our colleague from the World Bank Group, what you said about job restrictions being a major obstacle, what you described could be in any of the countries of the Global South that we worked, and I think that's very close to reality. But I think the main obstacle is actually the way we define work, the way we define women's work. The ways in which we do not recognize women's unpaid work, the way in which we do not recognize not the public sector, not the private sector. They don't recognize the burden of reproductive work, and that we do not have policies where that burden is shared by society, by the private, by the public sector. The second point, I will be very brief. I was a little bit worried when you spoke about protection in a complacent way. And I think this is very problematic because Saudi Arabia doesn't let women drive because they want to protect them. Women have to travel with a guardian because they have to be protected. Girls are not sent to school because we want to protect them. So that it's actually, protection is specifically about the subordination, the lower status of women. And I don't think we should mention it in a way that is not, that does not point out to it as a tool for restraining and constraining women. Our colleague from the private sector asked a very important question, where are the women? And at least from the countries where we work, most of the women working with pay, one form of pay or another, are in the informal sector. And you know very well that this is a sector that's growing. The whole move towards microcredit has actually also bloomed that informal sector. So this is a sector that is not protected, where there are no laws in force. So I think we need to think about this. My point before last, I think our colleague from USAID, and I really want to emphasize this. And you made 2 points about laws. And also about changing norms and attitude. And I think these two are really related together, but they're also related to a very important thing that we're working on, which is around family laws, because at least in many of the global countries in the global south, the divide between civil laws and religious laws is not real. Religious laws permeate labor laws, market laws, the penal code, etc. And unless a reform takes place in the letter of the law, I don't think we can be looking forward any form of real change. And the laws, they represent basically a society in a certain place. And just to give you an idea, you've spoken about citizenship. Citizenship law in Lebanon is a law that dates back from 1925. The law that governs NGOs in Lebanon dates from the Ottoman Empire, from 1919. So it's from another parallel world that doesn't exist anymore. And the last point, Mr. Channel talked about these things are absolutely expensive. But I disagree with you on one thing. It's not about the absence of resources. We are seeing resources. It's actually about the political choice of where these resources go. And there is less and less money for equality and more money for other things. And I think that's the role of all of us to redirect resources towards bridging the gender gap. Thank you.
Great, nice point.
You raised a number of, I think, important points, and maybe just one that I'll pick up on, the unpaid care work, right? Because globally, half of the working age population is female. Officially, 37% of GDP is driven by women. So there's a lot of unpaid care work. The global average on unpaid care work is about 3 times as much. So women on average do 3 times more unpaid care work than men. In some countries, though, that is as much as 10 times. So India, 10 times as much unpaid care work by women. And reducing that, I think, could be quite impactful. So about 60% of unpaid care work is routine housework. It's dishes, laundry. In developing countries, it's gathering firewood, getting clean water. Those are things, that 60% of the unpaid care work, we wouldn't miss that, right? If that was eliminated or automated or improved in some way, nobody would be clamoring. It's the other 40% of taking care of elderly relatives or your children, frankly, the things that women and men want to make more time for that I think could be quite powerful.
And just following on what Quaylen said, the World Bank and the ILO are discussing methodologies to be able to capture the unpaid care work, because part of the problem is it's not measured, it's not accounted for. We want to be able to start including it in global statistics. I also want to apologize, when I was talking about laws protecting women, I wasn't referring to Saudi Arabia, but rather a lot of the very extensive job restrictions that we see coming out of basically former Soviet economies. So the 456 job restrictions in the Russian Federation, almost 400 in the Kyrgyz Republic, in Belarus there are 182. The stated intention is actually to protect women from working in certain sectors. And the question is, what are you protecting them from? If these jobs are so dangerous for women, are they not also dangerous for men? And shouldn't we be looking at them more carefully? So it's not so much to, to impose certain values on women is using the law as an enforcement mechanism, but actually labor restrictions cutting women out of certain sectors. And I think you brought up a really great point on family law. We actually measure family law very, very extensively, and we try and reform family law where it stops married women from doing certain activities. And in fact, in one of our indicators, the Accessing Institution indicator, we disaggregate every question we measure on the level of marriage. The idea is, can a single woman do a certain transaction in the same way as a single man, and can a married woman do it in the same way as a married man? And almost all of the restrictions that we see are on married women, because in many countries around the world, when you marry, you give up part of your legal rights to your husband. And we've talked to a lot of women from West Africa, from the Middle East and North Africa, and they say the most fundamental thing that they would like to see changed is actually the head of household. Because sort of all of these other restrictions derive from the head of household rules, the travel restrictions, some of the citizenship requirements, having to get your husband's signature before you get an ID card or a passport, or needing his permission to work. All of that kind of stems from the legal embodiment of the male as the head of the household, and women being barred from that.
There's an article actually that I saw today about one of the lead soccer players for the Iranian women's soccer team, and they have travel restrictions there, and her husband would not let her travel to the last tournament, but she wanted to go to an upcoming tournament and her husband said she could not travel. The state overruled. So I guess your scoring potential on the team can trump some of these protection issues.
Thanks. And thanks for comments on that too. Okay, back here, and then I think we've got two more, and we'll have to close it out.
Okay, thank you so much. My name's Victoria, and I'm from the Commerce Department. And I thought you made a really good point about needing the gender issues and having it insert at the beginning of any project, of any movement, and so on. You know, just recently, I mean, we have quite a revolutionary movement in Uber, right? Just recently, Indonesia ruled that the Uber model is legal. So my question to you is there anybody that you know who is talking to Uber about, well, you know, Indonesia, or maybe are you working in countries that won't allow women to drive? And if so, are you advocating for equal, you know, drivership, whatever? So I'm kind of curious about the presence of gender issues in the present economic kind of revolutions.
So not that I know of. I think it's a great idea because you're sort of piggybacking on some of this pretty rapid adoption. I think similarly, I think it was today, read an article about women taxi drivers or women Uber drivers, and that being a safe haven against whether it's violence or just uncomfortable harassment during a taxi ride or other things. So I think there are some unique angles, whether it's through Uber and transportation or other mechanisms that can help accelerate the change.
And just on the Uber topic, so I'm not aware in Indonesia, but I know in Egypt, actually, Uber is partnering with Harassmap. So in Egypt, women face a lot of sexual harassment in public spaces, in transportation, basically anywhere. And having lived in Egypt, I can attest to that myself. But basically what they're doing is they're partnering to give sexual harassment training to Uber drivers, and also sort of what Harassmap does is it maps through an app where women face instances of sexual harassment in Egypt. So you can almost plot it, you know, where in certain places women are being harassed more, and then they can avoid them. So I actually thought it was a very, very innovative model and a nice way to use technology.
In Egypt as well, actually, they have the pink taxis, which are the taxis driven by women that are supposed to advise women on you can travel in this taxi and you will suffer, you know, less harassment. It will be safer. So
There were two, yes, way back, and then one was closer. And then we're going to have to call it quits in favor of a reception.
Hi, I'm Negar Abai with the Baha'is of the United States. I think this has been coming out in what we've been saying, but maybe merits more emphasis, is that part of women getting to equal and engaging men is also thinking about policies and laws and change in social norms that allow men to be more involved outside of work and in the family and in other areas. Because otherwise what happens is just the displacement onto more marginalized women. So having just recently come out of doing dissertation research with women participating in the teaching force in Ethiopia, where they're very underrepresented, you sort of have this laudable increase in the number of women who are participating in this low-paid profession, but then many of them are doing so by having childcare duties being carried out by younger nieces from rural areas that they've pulled out of school. So as long as it's still on women to do all of this, you sort of just will have contradictions within this. So that part of the broader discussion also needs to be about men in that sense.
Thank you.
Gloria Studham, actually, I made a comment on that where she said, we want to value women's work outside the home and we want to value men's work inside the home, and that's when we'll actually have equality.
Yeah, gotta say amen there. One final, there we go.
Two questions. The first one is, with global climate change, I think it's important to keep that gendered because most of the environmental infrastructure has been up to women to maintain, and it's an important infrastructure for women's work. And the other would be that this morning I went to the Hamilton Project discussing the new labor laws for the gig economy, and one of the things that they are proposing that they keep in is the anti-discrimination laws. They're getting rid of things like overtime and other regulations that would be problematic, but you know, for taking account of 6-minute Uber ride or stuff like that. But one of the things they're pretty specific about is making sure that discrimination on sex is maintained by regulation.
Yeah, certainly with what's going on in Paris right now, we are very focused on global climate change and the role of women not only in the negotiations themselves. There's an article from The Guardian where Mary Robinson has come out and said this is being dominated by men, and so just issues for women and gender issues are not being brought out in these negotiations. So God bless Mary for always being on the front lines there. But it's true, but not just in the negotiations, because like you said, in many places around the world, whether they're gathering fuel or growing crops or seeing the water rise around them, women are on the front lines of climate change, both being impacted by it, can also help to come up with strategies because they are constantly trying to work on a daily, monthly, yearly basis to respond to these changes. And so have ideas about solutions that can be there. So USAID works in many countries around the world, partnering with other organizations like IUCN to come up with gender climate change plans, work with countries to engage women. And it's certainly an important role for women, not just now in Paris, but you know, in the coming years and the implementation of whatever comes out of it.
I want to thank the Wilson Center for pulling this together. I want to thank McKinsey, World Bank, and USAID for allowing 3 remarkable people to use their time here. And I want to thank each of you for, I know you're overscheduled, I know you, for making time to be here. And I also want to thank you, but I want to charge you as well. I find that there's a danger in Washington with an entertainment value to these wonderful events. Right? I went to a movie the other night. It was great. I enjoyed it. I'll remember it. I'll quote, you know, guys, we'll do movie lines all the time. I'll quote it all the time. It's not going to change anything I do. And if that's what happens here, then I'd say let's quit and start going to movies instead. Let me suggest one of the things you're seeing here is a set of inroads to tools. The USAID has put together tools on infusing work to reduce and respond to gender-based violence in every section of our work. They're online. Check out the GBV work. The McKinsey report, it gets headlines with numbers like 12 trillion, but if you look in the back, there are pages of suggestions of what we can be doing to change things. What are the action points? World Bank has actually identified not just whether there is a law that prohibits, but exactly what law, what clause, what country. Reformers, you got a 15-minute read to figure out perhaps what your next area is. I want to suggest that we really have the tools and information today to make a difference. And I really appreciate that Wilson Center has put this together so that we can consider how to do that. And I look forward to hearing the remarkable things each of you do when you leave here. Thanks.
Thank you. And the cocktail can be accessed through this door right here. Okay, good. Yes, so we will go through these doors right here. Thank you, everybody, and I welcome you for a reception.